Tell me when. Yeah. Big crowd today. Exciting. Oh. Holly, we good?
Yep, they're still
Okay.
filtering in. Hold on.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started
Welcome.
in just a minute. We're just letting everybody in. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, Lori.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. We did want to start at the top of the hour or at least 1 minute after. So thanks so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you here for our negotiation mastermind panel. Um, Today, what we wanted to do was we wanted to bring together this group of top producers. Each one of them has built a successful business, but they've done it with different personalities, different experiences, and really different approaches. So rather than hearing from, one instructor's perspective, you'll get to hear six different viewpoints today on what has worked in the real world and why. So what I'm going to do today is encourage you not to look for the perfect script or like the magic phrase or anything like that. Really just listen for the mindset behind their decisions, really the preparation that happens before the negotiations begin, and some small habits that have made them more effective over time. So here's how today's session is going to work. We'll start by having each panelist introduce themselves, tell us how long they've been in the business. They're going to get a quick warm-up question, and then from there, we're going to go through several different discussion topics, and then we're going to wrap up with a Q&A. So if you've got anything that you're thinking about, make notes. You could even put it in the chat, and we'd like to get to a Q&A at the end. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start with the panelists. No favoritism, I'm promising right now. It's just who's my first panelist on my screen that I see. And I see Cleve Gaddis. So, Cleve, introduce yourself, tell us how long you've been in the business, and then answer in one sentence for me. What's the biggest difference between how you negotiate today versus your first year in real estate?
Oh wow. And by the way, I am going to assume that I am your favorite just because
Okay, fine.
I'm sorry, I can't help myself. No. I've been in real estate for 26 years. I actually got licensed in early 2000, but I really started full time in early 2002. And so I've been in the business for really full time for 24 years. And I came into business sort of through the front door, just as Tina and Christy did. Their dad was in the business, and my mom was in the business, so I came in working with her. And the reality is, the way I negotiate today, it doesn't even resemble in any way the way I negotiated when I first started in the business, because everything was a very emotional thing for me. I was worried about what people were trying to do and how could they possibly do this to me and my client, and I could come up with meaning of negative meaning for almost anything that was done by making assumptions. And I just don't do that anymore. It's my responsibility to take what my client is wanting and wishing for and to do my best to make it all work. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes the best negotiation leverage on my side of the transaction is what the other side of the transaction does. And so you have to let that stuff unfold. And so it's really, I don't have a lot of indigestion over negotiating, but I used to really get all wrapped up and so frustrated about it.
Yeah, and I've been there to relate, and I love the shift that you had. So thanks for sharing that with us.
You're welcome.
All right, Christy Valley, let's hear from you. Give us your intro, and then what's the biggest difference between how you negotiate today versus your first year in real estate?
Okay. I think most of you know me. I am, as Cleve said, second generation. So I would say easier for me to get into the business because I had some role models and I had support and I had people to look up to help me on my way. And so I also, like Cleve, have been in the business for 24 years. Hard to believe. I was trying to calculate it the other day. I keep wanting to say 22, and I think I'll just stick to 22 because then I won't age. If I just stay in real estate for 22 years, I won't age. But very, very similar to what I think Cleve is saying and what many of the other panelists will say, that first year you want everything to work because one, you want a paycheck. You're so
Mm-hmm.
desperate to make your, you know, self successful in real estate. And so you just have such a high emotion to all the things that go right and go wrong. And then the other thing is just the confidence of knowing the contract and how loans work and all the ins and outs and how you can actually solve a problem. That really only comes with time and doing it over and over and figuring out solutions over and over. So, just, confidence and problem solving is a lot different now than it was when I was first getting started.
Yep, looking at it differently, bringing a solution. Exactly. Awesome. All right, Holly Norman, you're up next.
Hey, everybody. So I have been in the business 23 years. I actually started out as a buyer's agent. So I was a buyer's agent for the first 3 years and on a team for the first 9 years that I was with REMAX Center. So what's different? So first of all, I didn't even see the seller's perspective when I started. For 3 years, I only saw the buyer's perspective of the transaction. So, and I wanted to win. That was just it.
Mhm.
I wanted to win, right? So I was only focused on the buyer's perspective. I was never focused on the seller's perspective. I never even talked to a seller, right? Um, so for me, it was all about the buyer and being a buyer's advocate. And this was, before Zillow, and we used to get sign calls, and that's how I got all my business, right? And so I had to be the first one there, and I had to pick up that buyer by the time I left that showing on one of my partner agents, my team leads listings. That's how it all started for me. So it's very different now because now I do look at leverage and I look at both sides of the equation. Confidence is certainly a big part of it, but it's not necessarily all about just winning for the one person. It's winning for everybody involved in that
Mm-hmm.
transaction.
Yep, absolutely. And always learning. I mean, starting with the buyer side, never talking to a seller, and then you end up doing both. So good answers. Nicole, let's hear from you.
I'm Nicole France, and I'm in our Ackworth office. I've been doing this for 26 years. I got my license when I was 22. I started working with a mortgage broker, so that's kind of the background and how I got into the business. And I still have my mortgage license, but don't really use it anymore. I think different negotiation is I was more of a numbers person coming into it because of the mortgage background. I definitely worked with just all buyers at the very beginning. So, like she said, just you see it from a different perspective when you now work with buyers and sellers. And most of my business has been, I don't know, maybe 60-40 listing. This year it's transitioned a little bit more 75-25, it seems like, towards listings. So you definitely look at the big picture a whole lot more.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks for that, Nicole. Okay, move on. You're next on my screen.
Oh, me?
Yep.
Yes. Hey, my name is Marwan Kara. I've been doing this for about 22 years now. And for me, uh, a lot of I came from the corporate world where, sometimes in the corporate world, it's a win-lose type scenario. And in the early goings, I think, the anticipation that you get from outsiders or people that know is that usually in negotiations somebody has to do better than the other. And I think
Mm-hmm.
over the years I've learned that it's really just win-win. I mean, and especially because in real estate, the negotiation is the first phase, and then people have to carry out and follow through till the closing. And you want all the sides of all sides uh, of the transaction to feel like there's incentive for them to keep moving forward, because the worst thing that could happen is for it to fall apart halfway through. And that's even more of a fallout than if it doesn't come together to begin with. So I think being in that win-win mentality is important. And another thing is kind of going for the trying to win on the things that matter. Like, if someone's, for example, negotiating a price versus let's get a lower price and also ask for a washer dryer. Sometimes just say, hey, let's focus on what matters here. Let's get a reduction of 5,000 and don't worry about that washer dryer. let them feel like they're getting something out of this too. So.
Oh yeah, I'll never forget Holly. Actually, I was taking Holly's class one time, and she said, stop trying to sell refrigerators and washers and dryers. We're trying to sell real estate here. So
I got
absolutely.
that. I did get that from Pat. He's like, can we keep it
Okay.
a real estate transaction? I got everything from Pat. So
Yeah. Okay, and last but not least, Hank, let's hear from you.
Well, I'm just grateful to be here today. I got into real estate about 22 years ago, got my license. Timing is everything, and I got my license right before the Great Recession. And so we had like flipped houses, built a few homes, and done some things on our own. And then in 2008, I decided I needed to be a realtor if I was going to try to make a living, and kind of
Mhm.
struggled through that for a few years. So it's really a tough question for me, and I've thought about it because kind of the origin story for me is really when sales were just not happening, and we were bleeding through the Great Recession. So I just wanted a contract, period. Not so. I think today the biggest thing that I've learned over the past 20 some odd years is, key things kind of jump out in mind. Um, don't be so, and it's some of what I've heard other people say. Don't be so focused on price. There are a lot of terms in an offer, things you can put into an offer if you ask the right questions. And some of that is asking questions of the listing agent and shutting up and just listening to what they say. So a lot of times I find people will tell you more than they sometimes maybe should that will
Mhm.
help your side just by being a good listener. Um, I think too, one thing that I notice with, is just that to an idea of leaving your ego at the door. Um, don't get in the way of the transaction. Sometimes we all see that happen as well. Being able to walk away, that's a key thing, or at least let the other side feel like you'd walk away. And then I find people respond well to reason and stories. Be it presenting an offer that might be dramatically below list price, or I don't know, due diligence. A lot of times if
Mhm.
it's just me handing an offer over or a due diligence amendment to address repairs, instead of it being just my opinion, I try to go out and again find comps, or I try to find enough, um, I guess, background information to kind of add some validity to what we're asking for within a due diligence amendment. So it's not just me and the buyers asking for X amount of money or repairs, but you take it layers and make it deep in terms of helping people understand what you found and why you found it and why you're asking what you're asking. Uh, Um, but yeah, so that's me.
Well, it
great.
sounds like you've learned a lot. So thanks for sharing everything, Hank. And all of our panelists, thanks for the quick intro and asking my warm-up question. But I'm going to throw it to Holly Fogel because she's going to start off. We've got about 6 or 7 questions to get through, and each panelist is going to answer one of them. And Holly, I'm going to let you kick it off.
Thank you so much. Geez, I got so much just from the opener. I feel like let's wrap it up. That was great.
Yeah.
No, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. So we're going to kind of go through different phases of the negotiation, and we're going to start with mindset and foundations. So Nicole France is going to help us with our opener. So Nicole, if you wouldn't mind, from the mindset and foundations area, what's the biggest misconception new agents have about winning a negotiation, and why does that mindset actually cost their clients money in the long run?
I think a lot of us answered that somewhat in our intro, but I think it's just figuring out like what's most important to your client. It's not always about the price. It's definitely not about just trying to go in for the kill and win. It just really depends on, asking the questions with and listening to the answers. Does the seller need a particular closing date? What is their story? Why are they moving? Are they concerned about appraisal? Is net proceeds the most important? It just depends on what everybody's, I guess, goal is in it. And if you can always try to work together, from my mortgage background, a lot of people are like, let's get the most off price. And I'm like, well, for your loan to value, you need closing costs paid by the seller, so that you're not putting all your stuff down. So I think it's looking at how are you going to benefit your clients the most and reach their goals but also being able to work. Because once you come in, if you negotiate all of your stuff up front with the purchase price and closing cost and all of that, but then you come in and you have a rough appraisal, if you haven't been able to create a rapport with the listing agent and the seller thinks that they've already given you all that there is to give, then you have a buyer that's spent money on inspections and this and that. And what if you can't come to an agreement on that? So I think it is kind of looking at, right now everything's about affordability. So for your client, is it more important to negotiate everything up front, or go in and talk to the listing agent? Hey, that AC unit's 23 years old. I have first-time home buyers that when they close, if that goes out tomorrow, they're not going to be able to afford a $10,000 HVAC unit. So how can you incorporate something like that possibly in, because we know the home warranty companies don't pay for a full, HVAC replacement, most of them anyway. So how can you just negotiate what is important, what's going to keep your buyers happy? And I think it goes back to, it's not just a transaction. It's not just about winning the deal or getting, that being able to walk away is a great thing. If you get in and you see the repairs are more than what you kind of thought, although the longer you're in the business, as you walk through a house, you're also looking at those things like, what is the house going to need? That's one of the first things I ask, even when I go on a listing appointment right now. How old's your HVAC? How old's your roof? How old's your hot water heater? Because that's what's important. And I think what you do and how you negotiate changes dramatically on what market we're in, so you have to kind of know what the market is. And the market over here might be different than the market in Duluth or Suwanee or something. So know and kind of ask the questions up front. And when you are going to ask for stuff for like your home inspection type stuff, get on the call, like the phone, make phone calls to your people, that your HVAC person or, your electrician. How much is this roughly going to cost? Shoot them a picture, get at least an idea. If not, ask AI. If you're not using AI for stuff like that, it's silly, because it at least gives you a range that you have to work with. So, and then making sure that even if you're representing the buyer, that your buyer's being realistic about all of it. But I think the biggest is communicating with the other side, knowing what's important to them, knowing what's important to your people, and being able to get through all of the stages, getting under contract, getting through, the appraisal contingency, the inspection contingency, and all of the different things that come with all of that. So that would be my 2 cents. It's work together with everybody and not just try to make it a win.
So just kind of a quick little follow-up. I feel like when I think back to when I would be working with sellers, and I'm thinking on the sell side right now, I always think of that, if expectations aren't met or set, that's where conflict arises. And real estate is just so emotional and everybody kind of talked about that in the beginning. We take it so emotionally when we're new, but buyers and sellers are emotional all the time because they don't do this very often. So when you go on your seller appointments, like, are you talking about, the negotiation points that could come up, or is that kind of when an offer comes in? Like, how do you kind of gauge on the seller side, uncovering those things? Do you do it up front, or do you just kind of wait and see what comes in?
No, I definitely set the expectation up front. Trying to get sellers to be a little bit more realistic. We're not in the same market anymore. It definitely over here is a buyer's market more so. Prepping the house. Is it ready, move-in ready? That's where you're going to get the most money. Here's the realistic price per square foot that we're seeing. Here's what the concessions are or have been in the last 30, 60, 90 days that we're seeing sellers give, so be prepared. Other people are going to look at that as well, to have that. And then it's not always the case, but a lot of times your first offer is your best offer. So, when those things come in, if it's 10,000 less than what the seller wants, okay, it's less than what you want. However, if we don't take this and you sit on the market for 2 more months and you make those mortgage payments and, everything that goes with it, have you really won, or are you better off to just, here, let's all work together and make it work? So, and setting those expectations too.
Great. And I think you made a great point about educating, your client on what market they're entering. Every price point has a different set of negotiations and different market conditions. So I think every buyer and seller, having that approach of this is the market you're entering, this is your $100,000 market, and looking at that, from that perspective is also helpful. So thank you so much for that, Nicole. Okay, Lori.
Okay. Well, I've got actually going to ask Holly Norman this next question because it has to do with preparation and discovery. And Holly, when you introduced yourself and said, you worked on the buyer side a lot, this question sort of starts almost there, and it can definitely be used on the seller side too. But let's talk about this, about how do you actually use comps and market data to build a negotiation position rather than just to justify a price?
Okay. So I actually have a 5-point plan, and I do it the same 5 points, whether it is for before a listing appointment or before a buyer is making an offer. The bullet points are a little different. So what they are, so let's just take it from a buyer's perspective, right? So
Okay.
the first thing I look at is trends. Then what is selling and why? What houses are selling? What houses are sitting on the market? I always approach it from a resale perspective, right? So we'll talk more about that too. From a buyer's perspective, I am absolutely calling the listing agent and I am asking the listing agent what is important to their seller, right? Because that's a wealth of information for you to have. And then what can I leverage, right? So based on my client and what their needs are. So trends, right? So when you're looking at comps, I always first pull, okay, is it closing costs that are being paid? Is it price reductions that are happening? Is it a combination of both? What are the trends that I'm seeing in any specific neighborhood? And we all know it's very neighborhood specific here, right? So what's happening in one neighborhood 2 blocks away may look totally different. So I really try to drill down first in the neighborhood and then I start expanding out. And I usually use elementary schools districts first when I'm expanding out. So once I identify some trends, the next thing I do is what is selling and why. So I read the property descriptions. Is the homes that sold all have new roofs? Do they all have renovated kitchens and bathrooms? And the home my client's interested in doesn't have these things, or does it have these things, right? What is it that's selling? Why are they selling? And how is the property my clients want positioned against what is selling? Then from a resale perspective. So I always think whether I'm going into a listing or I'm going into a buy side, if I had to resell this house in 7 years, what would be the positives and what would be the negatives, right? Because if, let's say there's no yard, right? No backyard whatsoever, but my client doesn't care and they don't want a backyard. But are they in a neighborhood that is mostly filled with kids? Like that's the demographic that's coming there. So 7 years from now, when they go to sell the house, now the backyard is a problem. If that's the case, then I need to negotiate for that position now so that 7 years from now, when they resell, I can say, hey, remember we got that discount up front. Now we got to pass that along, right? I mean, it's all dependent on the market, but I always look at it from the resale perspective. Ask the listing agent what's important. So a good example of this, I put a house under contract this week. The price was not important to my client. I had the seller. Price wasn't important. He's moving to South Africa. He doesn't want to take anything with him other than his family photos, right? He wants to leave the plates, the silverware, all the furniture. He's putting no value on it. He doesn't want to touch it. He wants the buyer to take it all on. That's what was most important to him. He was in a multiple offer situation, and the buyer that raised their hand and said, I'll take it all, don't worry about it, is the one he chose, right? So that was stuff I put that out in the listing, but me and the agent had a conversation. The other agent on the other side has been in the business a long time. So calling, it's not always about price. It's not always about closing costs. Sometimes it's about possession after closing. Sometimes it's about taking furniture. There's so many different reasons that people are moving. So identifying what those are, and then what can you leverage, right? So from my client, what is it that I can leverage that the seller needs that my client can easily give without hurting their position at all, right? So is it possession after closing? Is it, whatever it is. So I put all of that together in a package deal. And then I have the conversation, right? Here's the trends. And I just go down it. Here's the trends. Here's what's selling and why. Here's the approach from a resale perspective. Here's what the seller's agent said is important to them. And then here's what we can leverage. And I already know what's important to them, right? The very first time I talk to a buyer, we're having a conversation. Are closing costs more important? A lot of that depends on the price point, right? If you've got $1 million plus, they're usually not too worried about closing costs, nor do sellers want to pay their closing cost. But if you're sitting in a $300,000, now it's usually very important that the closing costs get paid. So we have those closing costs conversations. We have all of that up front. So before I ever make an offer for a buyer, I am already well aware of what that buyer needs to get to the closing table, right? We've had that discussion time and time and time again. So I really set it up from a perspective of here's what it looks like now. Here's what I'm doing to protect you and your future equity down the road, so that, I'm looking for clients for life. I'm looking for relationships. So that's what I'm trying to build from the beginning. And that's how I do it.
And I love that because, that's an incredible framework. And like you said, you've had that conversation with that buyer, and knowing their position in the market, their position where they are, you've got a framework. They're trusting. That would build automatic trust with me. If I were to hire you as my agent, I'd be like, okay, she gets me. She understands me. She's going to lead me and guide me into this without any question. I have complete trust. That's an incredible framework. Thanks so much for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's brilliant right there. And I think when we talk about getting consistent and having a system and doing things over and over again, that right there is a nugget everybody can walk away with today and put into place. Like, I love those 5 points. That is powerful stuff right there. Thank you so much for that, Holly. That was great.
Thanks, Holly.
All right, we are going to move into a buy-side negotiation question now, and I'm going to turn to Hank. So Hank, what's your approach? And this is probably kind of common that a lot of folks might be seeing right now. So this one I think is pretty timely, and I'm sure it's happened to all of us. But what's your approach, Hank, when a buyer wants to offer well below asking in a market where the offer has almost no chance of being accepted?
Great question. I think it depends on the situation. I had a client, for example, over the winter, early spring, and she told me, I'm looking at 2 neighborhoods. She said, like to be on the golf course, here's the budget, see if you can help me find something. So we looked at houses, we look at them in person, online. These homes were floating, and it's difficult to, I would say, even time of year, because of course, coming out of winter, you're kind of coming out of winter time low pricing, right? Prices coming into early springtime, late winter are going to be different than right now, looking back 6 months. So we were looking at sales in the neighborhood in the 950,000 range, maybe pushing $1 million. A lot of these springtime listings, early spring listings, were listed between 1.2 and 1.385. So she looked at that, and honestly, based on comps, first thing I always do is when we see a house that a buyer likes, is I'll go do like a buyer facing CMA. And I'll basically spend some time trying to see what we can crunch the numbers on. And then I present that to the buyer. And I said, this is kind of what I'm seeing. It's kind of a low to high range, what I think the house is worth as of right now. And it was funny because she still wanted to come in and offer $300,000 to $400,000 below list price. And I just told her, I was just candidly honest up front and said, there's just no way they're going to take this. I always tell people, I'm happy to write up any offer you want me to write up. Got no problem with it, but I always like to set expectations. And I hear that word coming up a lot in this call today. just set expectations to help them understand this is what I think could happen if we make this offer. We went through a couple that more times than not, she agreed with me. And what's funny is, as we went through a process of education based upon what sellers are offering for her price range, she went up in budget. She was able to find something she really fell in love with. And then it was interesting because we got into the summer and it went from, hey, I'd really like to find a house to, okay, now it's time. Lease is about to run out. Now, and I found this one house that I'm completely in love with. When I walked in the door, I want to buy it. All of a sudden, she went from wanting to negotiate $300,000-$400,000 off the price of the house to she came in, a reasonable discount, but still, it was something that when we had multiple offers we were competing with and we won. I debated with her on the idea of, well, it's cash. I'm paying cash. And sometimes too, we all have to continue to go back and again, educate people on if it's a multiple offer situation, you're the only one with cash and you're competitive, that is leverage. That's great. But if you're $400,000 too low, it's just not going to go anywhere. It doesn't mean anything. I had another client this summer who we were looking at a new construction home. A lot of times, obviously, there's not a whole lot of discount on brand new construction, but this was like a custom builder, kind of a one-off. My buyer told me, he said, I'd like to buy this house. It'd be our dream home, but we really don't want to spend more than $1 million, $1.1 million at most. I think the house priced at about $1.2 million. Looking at the comps, looking at how long the house had been on the market, unlike the other client with the other neighborhood, there weren't half a dozen comps that we could kind of compare and look and see a larger scale activity going on in a neighborhood. Looking at days on market and everything, I said, they might actually, and I kept, oh, by the way, too, and I kept talking to the listing agent, asking her, what kind of activity you had. In the meantime, too, my client had to sell a house. So she and I talked quite a bit because she'd asked me if we had any luck. Apparently, I was the only one who had a buyer who was interested in this house. And so she kept asking me how our open houses were going or how our showing activity over the weekends was going. And, at the end of the day, we got him under contract. We went back, we made an offer 100,000 below list price, and the builder accepted it. So again, I think it depends on right place, right time, setting the expectations and trying to help people understand, there are, I don't know, the biggest thing I've been trying to help people kind of get is I see sellers that are still pricing the house based upon 2022 pricing. But when they start to go through price reductions, at some point, you look at like FMLS data based on final list price, sellers are still getting, depending on the market you look at, I know price point, anywhere 95, 98% of final list price. So that's the other side of that conversation too, is with a listing client is, okay, what do we do when we get an offer that's 150,000 too low? Again, it makes it really, I think, compared to probably 20 years ago for me, today I would have the ability to sit down confidently and say, we talked about it up front. I told you what what we'd list the house for. You wanted to push the number a little bit higher. Sometimes for a previous client, you'll do that. And, it's just a matter of trying to help people kind of learn, educate them on the market and kind of why, if you get 3 offers and they're all in basically the same price range, it's probably the market telling you this is really what your house is worth. Just having the confidence to set expectations. Jokingly, I tell buyers, all the time, I don't care what house you buy. I just want it to be the right one for you. And it's just a matter of really trying to help them understand, and it doesn't have to be high-end luxury. I've got one right now as a first-time home buyer. We were looking at a house. It was, I think, listed at 245. He wanted to, come in at tax appraisal at 140.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And just helping them understand up front, that's never going to be accepted. Sometimes could they still balk at it? Yes. I think sometimes, the older I get, the longer I've been in the business, you get a little more credibility that, well, okay, maybe I'll listen to Hank this time, but not always. But yeah, it's just a matter of really trying to kind of talk it through and explain and help them come to terms so that you've got the best chance you can.
Well, I was going to say, I think you made a good point with that first example of when people come in low, what is their true motivation? Like you said, the lease was still, she had a couple of months. Did she really fall in love with it? And I know someone from the office had said, if somebody does like a low offer, would you be okay if you don't get this house? Reinforce to them, hey, are you okay if somebody else outbids you? So that they're truly motivated for it or they're not. And I think that first case, that seemed to be the big thing because when she walked in one and really liked it, she's like, oh no, this is good, and it was getting closer to her time frame too. So that could be a point, that I
There's
kind
a
of got from what you said.
Sure. And there's a big difference, huge difference. And I think we all have to understand this with buyers, need and want. Don't
Mhm.
want a new house. So many times early spring, well, I want one. I'm thinking we need one. We still have a house to sell. Haven't even thought about putting it on the market yet. Um, how motivated they're really going to be. I talked to an agent a couple of years ago, a listing I had multiple offers on it, and agent told me she made an offer. She said that she had been showing houses to her clients for over a year without being successful on a contract, and she said they had a house they needed to sell, hadn't put it on the market yet. Their offer wasn't particularly motivated. Showed me they were motivated, and it really boils down to the fact they had a house to live in. We've got to
Mhm.
understand, I think, before we spend a lot of extra time on a potential client, is it just I want to buy a house or I need to?
I
There's a
need to
big
buy a house. Yeah.
waste my time, or is it something that actually they really want my services and going to put it to use?
Right. Same thing with sellers. Do you want to list or do you want to sell? So great. Thank you so much, Hank. That was excellent. Appreciate it. Lori?
Alrighty. Yep. Okay. Well, now I want to bring it to Marwan. Marwan, let's talk about the sell side negotiations for just a little bit. So tell me, what's a low cost concession you've used that meant little to the seller, but a lot to the buyer? We talk about
Mhm.
sellers and helping them, and they've all got their net, but what's a low cost concession that you've used that meant little to the seller, but greatly to the buyer?
Um, One aspect I think, especially as it applies to first-time buyers, is I try to help sellers understand the value of being accommodating on the closing date, sometimes typically towards the end of the month, and also being accommodating towards padding, allowing the buyer to pad the offer with closing contributions from the seller. As an example would be if we're dealing with a house that's around $400,000 and we agree on a price of 400,000. If that buyer were to come back and say, hey, in order to help us with have some reserve funds later for some of the renovations that we need, or to kind of ease the upfront costs on ourselves, would you be okay if we were to offer you $410,000 and the seller contribute 10,000 to our closing contributions? And in cases like that, that really means a lot to the buyer. It really eases a lot of their upfront financial burden. And
Mhm.
for the seller, it's still the same net. I occasionally get a little bit of resistance from sellers. I think we all do probably. And they say, well, I'm having to pay the commission on that extra 10,000.
Mhm.
And so a lot of times I just say, well, I'm sure that I certainly would be accommodating just to doing the commission on the original net amount of
Yeah.
400. But and a lot of times the other agent is willing to do so as well. But I think it goes a long way in terms of enabling a buyer to manage their funds up front. And just a couple of other things. I mean, I feel like in general, even though it might cost $500 or $600, I feel like a home warranty benefits a seller as much as it does a buyer. I think especially if you have a situation where some of the systems are older, whether it's a water heater or the HVAC or
Mhm.
all that. I feel like especially during the due diligence period, if the buyer wants to come back and renegotiate, telling the seller to be accommodating towards a home warranty will kind of ease the process, kind of ease the negotiation there. And it will give them a lot more peace of mind 3 or 4 months down the road if something were to happen. Then the first line of defense would just be that home warranty. Um,
Mhm.
that's something I think can benefit everyone. And then the last thing I would say is that a lot of sellers sometimes overvalue their custom fixture, whether it's shelving or appliances that match the others, and they really want to keep one or two of those things, thinking they're going to use them at their next home. Really, those don't have as nearly as much value as they think, but they have a lot of value to that buyer who is buying them. and doesn't have to now go out and buy new things. It has things that are already fitted and tried and true in the space that they're trying to work with. So those are just a few things I think that sellers can be accommodating on that aren't very costly, but go a long way in terms of the buyer's perspective.
Yeah, I agree. And like especially like you gave that example of the $400,000 price point and educating the seller on the typical buyer is first time home buyer. This is what they need some relief on or help on, and these are usually the important things that could cost not as much to you. So, absolutely. Thanks for bringing those 3 points. Appreciate that.
Great. Good stuff.
Yep.
All right. Now we're going to talk a little bit about tactics and counter tactics. So I'm going to switch to Cleve now. And if you could give us your perspective on how do you keep your own client, from negotiating against themselves during the due diligence time period.
So I'm going to talk about this a little bit from the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective, but I want to start with a story. It was sometime March or April of 2008, and I'm negotiating a transaction. I'm representing the seller. The home is in Peachtree Corners. It's on, I forget the name of it. If I mention the name of the subdivision, most of you guys would recognize it. And we were at the very end of the negotiation. I'm representing the seller, and the buyer gave a very simple list of repairs. And back then, you had to do that. There was no due diligence period. You had to negotiate through everything. And one of the items on there was to clean the gutters. And the seller, it just blew his mind that they would be asking him to clean the gutters. And so he said no to that one item. He agreed to everything else. We sent the amendment back over saying no. And then literally within 5 minutes, we got a termination from the buyer. And I'm thinking to myself, hey, there has got to be something going on that I don't understand and the seller does not understand. And so I called the buyer's agent and I said, hey, obviously we struck a nerve with something because you terminated so fast. And if you could kind of explain to me what's going on from the buyer's perspective. And this buyer's agent said that this woman's son, and it makes me sad to even talk about this now, but this son had been cleaning her gutters, fell off the ladder, and died. And she did not want to take on the responsibility of having to deal with gutters. I called the seller. I told him exactly what was going on. Not only did he clean the gutters, he spent $3,000 and installed gutter guards on the entire home.
Wow.
And so when I look at negotiating, I look at it as buyers, we have to keep them from letting, and I always picture the little 12-year-old version of this grown human sitting right on his or her shoulder right over here. And I know mine shows up all the time. Every time you hear me say something goofy, it's 10 or 12-year-old Cleve who's talking to you. And so we have to keep buyers from letting this little person on their shoulder influence them in a negative way. And with a seller, we have to change their focus. So they can't be negotiating with their current buyer because that wraps up too much emotion, but they can be negotiating with the next buyer if they run off the current buyer. And so I try to get them to think one step ahead for the future, meaning if you do not do it for this, is the next buyer probably going to ask as well? And if it has to do with electrical, and it has to do with plumbing, and it has to do with structural, and it has to do with the fact that the HVA system is 317 years old, then it is going to come up on the next inspection. And so it's not a matter of whether or not you want to do it for this person. It's a matter of whether or not you're going to be forced to do it for the next person. So with a seller, I try to substitute the current buyer, the emotions of the current buyer, with a buyer who does not exist yet. So I can get them to get all of the emotions out and not be mad at the person for what they're asking for. And then for a buyer, to try to get the buyer to get the little boy or little girl off their shoulder who says, don't you let them get away without doing that. They better be giving you this. You're paying them good money. You better get all the stuff that you're supposed to get. In order to make that little person be quiet, I have to give the buyer something else to measure things against. And so about 10 or 12 years ago, and when Holly started talking about her frameworks, I got so excited because to me, And when you hear me talk about a framework, I'm giving you the framework because I've screwed it up so much that I have to have a way to make sure that I don't continue to screw it up in the future. So I have to give myself a new process to follow. So I'm thinking through things. And so I do two things. When we get ready, we put a home under contract. I send the buyer a list of all of the potential home inspections they could have done. And I mean pool inspection and outdoor lighting and have somebody inspect the shed. I mean, there is list all over this thing. And it's designed to make sure there's inspections all over this thing. And it's designed to make sure they know all of the things they need to be considering so they can first narrow it down. And sometimes people say, well, doesn't that complicate things? Well, no, it doesn't complicate things because if it has a shed, I had a buyer buy a shed and buy a house, not just a shed, sorry, bought a house that had a shed. And like 3 weeks later, we had the termite company come out and that thing was just about to fall over because it had termites everywhere in the roof and the floor. It had it everywhere. And I wish that I had thought about, okay, maybe we need to have somebody inspect that. So I have them do that. But more importantly, when the home inspection is done, I send them like kind of like a legend for the home inspection. You know, like a map has a legend and it tells you what each one of these
Mhm.
different markings means. And it gives them ways to categorize things on the home inspection report. So it
Hmm.
says, this one is a C, and C means it's just a comment from the home inspector because 60% of that home inspection, the home inspector is just making comments. You might need to do this, or you might want to, ask for this. There another one would be MI, which would be we need more information on that. I can't tell you how many times they've said, hey, we don't see the gas key. And the buyer's like, I need to have that gas key. And so what we really need to do is just make sure they give us a gas key, give us more information, or how did the light fixture work, or something like that. And so there's some items that need to be repaired by the seller before you move in. And there's a lot of items that you care so much as the buyer about the aesthetics of the way is being repaired that it makes more sense for you to wait and repair it after the fact. And I'll give you an example. A lot of times we have cracks in driveways and it'll say you need to seal up all the cracks. And I just tell the buyer a story that, hey, in that case, it might be aesthetically very important to you because I remember going out to a home where the seller had patched all the cracks in the driveway and it literally looked like the driveway had the worst case of purple varicose veins you've ever seen in your entire life. And the buyer just thought it was disgusting. And so you have to give people other options. They have to give them other things they can do with the issues they find. And so the big ones are the seller to do it prior to closing, the seller to provide an allowance in lieu of doing it, or the buyer to do it after closing. And Holly, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say if you help people kind of have another thing to do with stuff that bothers them in their mind to say, okay, well, I really would like to do that myself. I would say the list of what my clients ask for is probably a third as long as it
Mm.
would otherwise be. And people say, well, don't you feel like you're doing them a disservice? No, I don't feel like I'm doing them a disservice at all. I want to make sure they understand everything they need to know, but I don't want this little boy or girl, this 12-year-old saying, you need to get all you can get, or how dare they not be willing to fix a water problem, or how dare they not be, willing to fix the drainage in the yard. And that's what a lot of people think is they spend time being insulted because somebody doesn't want to do something when in the whole scheme of things, it doesn't matter anyway. So three just quick points in closing. Number one, if you think you have any idea what's going on the other side, I can assure you, you do not. Like it doesn't matter how good you ask questions, you really don't understand what's driving all of the decisions. You need to give sellers something else to negotiate with or compare to, and that's the next buyer. And I literally will say, hey, if you don't want to do it for this buyer, I have to ask you a question. Are you going to do it for the next buyer if they ask for it again, or do you think they will ask for it? And then for those buyers, just give them something to use to defend themselves against a little immature person who keeps giving them so much advice. And in many cases, will if you leave him or her to it, the little 12-year-old, they will actually screw it up. And then instead of Holly being able to eat, dinner in her breakfast room overlooking her amazing thing, this house that she loves, 6 months later, she's going to drive by and somebody else is going to be eating dinner at her breakfast table overlooking her views in the backyard. And they want the home. They just can't get over themselves to get there in many cases.
That's such a great point. It kind of goes back to the whole, it's such an emotional transaction, and every person's so different and motivation plays into it. Are they going to be homeless if they don't get this house? Like, there's so many things that we have to manage, you know, with expectations, but that's so great. You know, thinking about, is this going to come up again? You know, is this item going to come up again? And just having them reframe. So great nuggets there. Excellent perspective. Thank you so much, Cleve. That was great.
Yep. All right. I'm going to wrap it up with Christy Valley. And actually, great question for you since you're one of our brokers, because this has to do with Georgia contract and law to a certain extent. But, you know, and we've been all working on this for probably the past few years. But our question is, now that sellers aren't required to offer buyer agent compensation, how are you handling that conversation with buyers and with listing agents? Because that has kind of become part of the negotiation, you know?
So on the buyer side, so I think it starts with the seller, right? When you're meeting, you've got to give them the framework. You've got to give them the
Yeah.
options. And I think as agents that have been in the business for a long time, we've got to be really, really careful not to make assumptions on what the consumers might or might not know. When you go to meet with a seller, you cannot assume that they know that things have changed. And same with buyers. They don't pay attention to real estate like we do. So unless they are really an astute person, really involved, staying up to date with things, most people don't know what it used to be. And so I think as realtors, we have to be really careful not to go, well, we used to do it this way, and sellers used to pay the compensation almost all the time. I think we've got to be real careful to get that out of our verbiage, because that's not what we have now. That's a market 3 years ago. That's not today's market. And so we have to just know that when we are either presenting in a listing presentation and we're giving them the three options that are in our, you know, listing agreement, they can either provide no compensation, they can provide a set compensation, or they can make it negotiable upon receiving the offer. Turn that right around when you're meeting with a buyer. The seller has the option in their agreements to offer these three options. And I think that the thing that you have to go back to and being okay or being confident in explaining what your fee is, whether it's as a listing agent or a buyer's agent, is what is your value? What are you bringing to the table? And a listing presentation is very easy. It's like, we're spending money on this and we're doing this and we got all this stuff. And like for me, in my perspective, the listing presentation pretty much outlines everything that we're doing for you, right? All of our value. A lot of people and a lot of realtors don't have that same presentation for a buyer. So I would say go back to, you know, what are you doing with your buyer consult? Do you have your values outlined clearly for a buyer to go, oh, okay, that's why I'm going to pay her 3% if the seller doesn't pay it, because she's doing all this or he's doing all that. So I think you've got to be really careful there. I had a broker call in just last week. It was a buyer's agent in our brokerage representing the buyer, and the builder was offering a bonus. And she said, well, how do I handle that? Because I've already set my compensation. And so if you were to get audited on compensation and you had to change that, you have to be adding value in order to charge more or receive more. So she had to she did amend the agreement, but it was amended in a very specific way of exactly what added value, what added items, what added activities she was going to do for this new construction client that she wasn't going to do when they were looking at resale, in order to overcome that and be able to accept a bonus. And I think we've got to think of it that way when we're meeting with buyers. Specifically, it's, you know, are we willing to go door knock their favorite neighborhood to see if somebody else is interested in selling? Are we going to do a mailer for that neighborhood? Like, what are all the activities we're going to do for this buyer so they can feel like we are worth our 3%? And as far as talking to listing agents, I think what you meant was the listing agent receiving a phone call from a buyer's agent, maybe?
Yes.
I think most of us, and maybe you're not, but in most of the agreements, we mark negotiable. That's, you know, we set our compensation on the listing side, we mark it as negotiable on the buyer's agent side.
Mhm.
If you're still setting the compensation and the seller's, you know, wants to do it that way, then obviously when they call you, you just tell them what the set compensation is. But for our team, the majority of them are negotiable. So when a buyer's agent calls, the majority of us just say, hey, please submit it with your offer and we'll review it along with all the other terms of the offer. We don't set it. And I think it's going to lean more towards that direction anyway. So we're just going to go ahead and go that route. And that's what we suggest that our sellers do. Now we do on the listing appointment, of course, set the expectation that they're probably going to be asked for a certain amount. So we don't leave that out of the expectation conversation, but that is how we handle it on our end.
Okay, yeah, and it's just, go ahead, Holly.
No, I was going to say, I was wondering if most people had just kind of moved to that model more of just put it in the offer. I see Susan kind of shaking her head no. So I was wondering how many people, you know, if it was still a lot of people doing the traditional co-op, you know, at 7% or whatever, and then we split it. I was
It just depends. I think it
Mhm.
depends. We literally have a slide in the presentation that goes through how compensation works with the seller. We tell them they can offer no compensation, they can set a compensation, or we can make it negotiable. Once we explain their options, most of them choose to leave it negotiable. And we do, you know, if they want to set it, we can set it. We allow that too. So we don't necessarily say you have to do it this way. We just explain their options and give them, you know, the pros and cons of doing all of them. Or of each of them.
I mean, what I keep hearing, and all of our panelists, thank you so much, because what I'm hearing a lot of is each one of you pretty much has a process, and I think we've got some great takeaways with some frameworks here that people, if they didn't already have them, could implement. I think we could probably open it for Q&A unless we've got any in the chat, Holly.
Check in the chat right now. I don't see any questions put in here. We didn't really prompt any, but we do have 2 or 3 minutes. If somebody wanted to raise their hand and unmute, we'd be happy to take a few or comments.
If not, we'll do a quick lightning round to close it out.
Don't see it. White, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I appreciate everybody doing it. I'm doing a lot of this, but it just really, you know, it just tells me I'm doing a lot of the right things.
Good.
Okay. I see an audience member, Brian Chang, says he has a question. Okay. Maybe.
Hold on, here is, how would you go about negotiating compensation when submitting an offer? Would that be for the buyer? So submitting the offer, writing in your compensation? I think that might be the question. Yes, for the buyer. So how would you write in, what would that look like, writing in your compensation?
So I think back to if this compensation had changed prior to the craziness of COVID happening. You remember we were removing due diligence and we were removing the ask for home warranty. We were doing everything we could to get this low inventory environment to get the house for our buyer. Don't you think that buyer would be like, I'll pay my own compensation? Because it would have been, you know, it would have been the next thing that would have been off the table. Or, you know, of course, we had some that didn't do due diligence. And so I think that how you go about negotiating it for a buyer it goes back to the very beginning of explaining how compensation works on the front end now, not how compensation used to work, how compensation works now. And when you get to that house where your buyer wants to ask for the full amount that you're charging to be paid, and you ask for that and they counter it, then you have to have a discussion with them. It's no different than closing cost, in my opinion, and how you handle closing cost. If you're asking the buyer for $15,000 in closing cost, that's no different if they come back and say, hey, we're not paying 15,000, we're paying 10, we'll pay 10,000. Same with your compensation. If you can switch gears and think of it that way, it really is no different than how you would negotiate closing costs.
Susan? Thank you.
Christy, I think though it all depends on the absorption. So if you're in a buyer's market, and you say, well, we don't know if we're offering a compensation, but 75% of the other listings are, I think that puts your seller at a disadvantage. They look worse, I think, to the other sellers in the marketplace that are straight out saying, we'll give you this, whatever this is from the seller. Now, in the COVID era, I had buyers offer to pay my commission and their agent's commission, both sides, right? The whole shebang, trying to get offers. I didn't win, but we tried, trying gangster moves. I think it just depends. But I tried your way, where you say we're open, and I got reacted to like by the buyer's agents. And you may not get these calls that I get because I'm an individual agent. It was some pretty shitty, like they were pissed off. They did not react nicely. And so I think I lost.
Well, we don't
showings.
say we don't know what they're paying. That's something.
No, I said that they are open to, put it in your offer. We are open to, as just another factor of the contract. And it got reacted to really, really ugly. So I felt like I lost showings personally. But maybe
that might be a different market than what. Yeah, we're not experiencing that, but that might be. I don't know. I think it would be interesting to hear what some of the other agents are experiencing if they're calling listing agents and they're saying at a number. Are they saying it's negotiable, but they're prepared to pay this amount? Are they saying, what are they saying when you call them? I don't show a lot of buyers, so I can't really comment on that. So you guys have to tell me what the buyer's agents are experiencing.
Anyone from working with buyers?
I mean, I
Wanna
have,
chime in?
even on the listing side, when people call and ask me, I just say, hey, the sellers are reasonable, but they are asking for it to be negotiated into the contract. I haven't really had much kickback on that or people not show the house accordingly. I think that just kind of helps set expectations though of don't come ask for $100,000 off or, 20% off the price of the house and you are going to take full commission. Like it's all in the whole presented offer and how we can make it work. So, but I've not either had my seller say, nope, I'm not going to pay the 3%. So I think it's worked out fine across the board. But I also agree it could be how competitive is your market or not. And
Holly?
I agree with Susan. So and Nicole. So I think some of it is market driven. If you're sitting in Johns Creek and in higher price points, I think you can get buyers that are more willing to compensate their agents. If you're sitting in Loganville and Grayson, I think that's a completely different market. I had a listing that was a divorce listing and they absolutely refused to pay compensation. We brought them 4 different offers and 4 times they refused and they never sold their house. They ended up back in court and they spent more money on court than they would have if they would have just paid the compensation. So it's a very real thing that buyers will walk away from a transaction where the seller is not paying compensation or is paying compensation short. Now, I will say on the listing side, I get a lot fewer agents asking me what the compensation is. And I don't ask anymore either. I write it into my contract. The amount that I want, I write it in there. And then if it ends up being negotiated, which I've had that happen, and I've had my buyer walk away from the deal because of it. So it happens. It absolutely happens. And it's something when compensation is what's getting in the way. It's sad, I think, that we're all sitting in this situation. But yes, I agree. It's very market driven with where your market is.
Yes, I think if you go in town, which I think it would be great if we had some in-town agents comment on this, because the environment there is much more negotiable. Wouldn't you say, Robin?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about it on the listings that I've had, and I haven't had any issues. And most of my sellers are selecting it's negotiable. I'm open to paying it, putting it in your offer. I haven't gotten any negative pushback. I mean, it's sort of like, okay, fine, it's totally fine. They just add the exhibit and we move on. Um, it matters too, is what someone else mentioned this. What's the price point? You know, am I selling a 1 bedroom, 1 bath condo, which is brutal market in town right now? You know, you really, and it's going to appeal to a first time home buyer. In your conversation with the seller, it's like, you can do any of these options. The recommendation, you know, it's kind of like, I would recommend that you go in this direction, because a first time home buyer on a 1 bedroom, 1 bath is, they're going to ask for it and they're probably really going to need it paid. And in order to compete with in the market, it needs to be something that you offer. So, yeah.
Good point.
Thank you. I don't someone was just asking about market driven. So I think, Brian, I think they're talking about each area, like if it's if it's a buyer market or a seller market, or a market where homes are moving really fast. So I think it's the strength of the market conditions of that location is what I was taking from that.
And let's just not say percentages of compensation. There's no
I
standard.
thought we worked
Not-
for the same company,
Not
though. We're
not
allowed to do that.
everybody on the Zoom is at the same is in our
Oh.
office. So
I thought we were all at the same company.
yeah, sorry.
All right. So any other questions or comments? This is being recorded, so you'll all get a copy of the recording. I just can't thank you guys enough for your time and your expertise and your perspective. Really good stuff. I love hearing it because I don't get to hear like the negotiation side as much anymore. So kind of brings me right back to like being at that table. So good job. You guys are very impressive. Any other final thoughts, Lori, as we wrap up?
Nope, just thanks again. And I hope everybody has some great takeaways. I think each of our panelists gave some great takeaways. And, you know, I hope guys can put it into action.
Yep. And we'll be doing more of these panels each every other month or so. So look for more of these. And we'd also love your input for ideas for additional panels moving forward. So we thank you so much. Y'all have a great day.
Have a great week.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was good.
Is it recording?
I'm gonna stop right now.
Okay.
If I get to my menu.